Hey, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to SafeDefend Live. I'm Dave Evans, filling in for Phil Nichols, and I'm here with my favorite former FBI agent, Dr. Greg Vecchi. We're going to talk about what's not being done and how we need to be proactive to solve the targeted violence problems in our schools and workplaces, and the things that other companies are missing that we can help with. Doc, take it away.
I will, Dave. Thanks so much for having me again. It's good to see you. It's always nice
Yes,
to
sir.
have a change in face occasionally. So, hey, yeah, what you're bringing up is really important, I think, because there's just a lot of bad information, bad assumptions, myths, and things like this about this whole targeted violence thing, both response and preventive. And so I think it's important that we kind of talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that we do at SafeDefend, and we always think of it in terms of response. It's prepare and notify and protect, and that's pretty easy to understand on right of bang or right of the attack, because you have to have preparation to do the escape or evade or engage the offender, stop the bleed, all that preparation stuff. Preparation as far as setting off the system and the notification and all the things that makes SafeDefend what it is. It is, in my opinion, the best response technology out there. But when we say prepare, we kind of forget that prepare is not just on responding after the event happens. I mean, that's certainly, everyone knows that. When I'm looking at preparation, I look at it actually from two perspectives. One is you've got prevention preparation measures, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and then what we typically understand and talk about most of the time is the response preparation measures. And so prepare is not just a response thing. It's not just preparing to respond. It's also preparing to prevent the attack, to intervene the attack, to mitigate the attack, potential attack, whatever you end up doing. And so when you're defining preparation, it's not just training, right? I mean, training is obviously a very important part of preparation, both right and left of bang. However, you got to have a plan, and you got to train that plan, and you got to then practice or drill that plan. So on both sides of bang, or both sides of the attack, preparation includes both planning and training and drills. And we don't think about that a lot of times in the proactive area. And so if we're trying to get in front of the problem, uh, the common terminology that's out there, which again I'm not a big fan of, and it sounds good, is this see something, say something. That is the basis of the preparation that you do and the planning to stop a potential attack. But there's more to it than just see something, say something. Just like there's more to it than saying run, hide, and fight on the response side. It's just not as accurate as it should be. So when you're breaking that down a little bit, there's basically four areas that you got to deal with, or you should deal with, in terms of doing everything you can to prevent the attack in the first place, or at the very least, mitigate it. Now, let's start with mitigation. So we talk about mitigation. Mitigation is part of the FEMA, the Homeland Security Emergency Management cycle, right? Mitigation is the first. It's mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Now, that whole group of things kind of indicates that you're preparing for the attack that you really can't stop. And that is true in that perspective. What we want to add in front of mitigation is prevention and even forecasting, which is basically a time series approach to being able to determine who is more likely going to be violent and be accurate in that. And so when you're talking about mitigation procedures, you're talking about things that might mitigate the attack and possibly stop the attack. So we always talk about physical security. We talk about locked doors. We talk about uh, metal detectors. We talk about putting a guard up front, having some sort of a visitor management system or technology, things like that. And those are all great things. Okay, but if you're just going to do that to try to prevent, you're missing a whole bunch of stuff that if you do put in place or consider doing some of these, really increases the ability to stop these attacks before they happen, to identify who's going to be violent, to intervene quicker, and things like that before it actually gets to the attack. So mitigation is one everybody talks about for prevention. We're going to buy a lock, we're going to put a fence around the building, all that other stuff. Beyond that, we have three things that we want to deal with, and three things that SafeDefend pushes as part of our end-to-end approach to preventing and responding to these types of targeted violence. So let's talk about threat assessment first. Okay. Well, actually, let me tell you all three first. There's threat assessment, there's risk assessment, and there's a vulnerability assessment. Each one of those are separate disciplines, separate approaches, although they kind of intermingle in practice. You kind of have, like, you can't have a threat assessment without some sort of risk assessment or vulnerability assessment. But the differences are simply this. The threat assessment, we've talked about this before. This is a pathway model. We know that when all of these attacks happen, the offender, the attacker, the bad guy is going to go through pretty much the same steps every single time. They're going to come up, they're going to have some sort of a grievance almost always. And that grievance becomes so bad that they believe that violence is the answer. And then they go to decide that they want to kill someone, for example, kill their teacher, kill the bully who's bullying them. Then they start to research and plan, and then they start to prepare. They get the weapons. Maybe they test the feasibility of their plan, and then they hit, right? They attack. And so those areas is what we deal with threat assessment. And it's based on behavior. It's based on normal behavior that is not normal anymore, right? I guess what I'm saying is that you got baseline behavior, which is normal, and changes in those behavior because the person's in crisis, then changes their how they usually behave. They're now all of a sudden they're interested in guns. Now they're interested, in magazines and all this other stuff, looking at previous attacks and things like this, right? So that's your threat assessment piece. So that's really kind of getting in front of a potential threat. It also can be used, the same process can be used for not necessarily targeted violence that's aimed at outside, like to a bully or to a teacher or to the school or workplace, same there too, but also internal violence, targeted violence. So kids that are suicidal, they go through the same thing. They get into crisis, they can't cope with it. They believe that killing themselves is the answer, and they still go through research and planning until they finally commit the act or attempt, right? So that's threat assessment. That's a big piece of what we do here at SafeDefend, especially within the SafeDefend Academy. We provide training on how to do the threat assessment. We can come in and start it from scratch and build a team in the school or workplace. If they already have a team or a structure in place that might be mandated by the state, we can add value based on our understanding of the offender and how all this works to basically increase their success. Or we could just be available as when it gets really bad or they're unsure, they can call up for help. So we have some schools that kind of keep us on the side. If something comes up, they give me a call, and then I'll review the case and then help them with the threat assessment, right? They just need like an outside, fresh set of eyes on it. So that's threat assessment. The next thing is risk assessment. Now, risk assessment is different than threat assessment. Risk is the probability that something's going to happen, right? And we see this a lot with in the mental health community, like for example, when you have a child who is problematic, and they go and they get testing done by a psychologist, right? Well, these tests that are trying to determine risk is just a probability, right? And it's kind of probability based on a group of similar people, similar ages, similar backgrounds, and things like this, right? And so it's good for gauging probability, but it's different than threat assessment because it's not focused really on one person. It's more on the probability that violence is going to happen. So risk assessment, though, when you talk about risk and how that helps threat assessment. So, for example, in threat assessment, you have specific behaviors that they all go through. We talked about that, right? So, like they all in crisis, and they determine that violence is the answer. Well, there are certain risks that can enhance that problem. They're not exactly a cause, right? And so it might be, we talk about mental illness. That's one of the several 800-pound gorillas in the room that everybody talks about.
Yep.
Mental illness is not connected with violence necessarily,
Nope.
right? They can be violent, but they may not be, right? And so you can't base your threat assessment on the fact that someone has a mental illness or some struggles. But the mental illness as a risk affects perception, affects how they view the world. So that grievance now is, they have a delusion that the person that they have the grievance with is, from the CIA or from another planet, right? I mean, you see this stuff. They have delusions, hallucinations, and things like this. Well, these are very real to these people, right? They're not kidding. They really
are.
See that, right? And so what happens then is that changes the perception and actually enhances the perception of the threat to that person. But it's not a cause. It just adds. So that's a risk. So risk assessment, you can apply to threat assessment. You can also apply it to vulnerability assessment. Say you're going to look at your buildings. Vulnerability assessment is looking at your environment, avenues of approach that the offender could possibly take, the best times of day where attack is more likely than not, who's going to be more likely attacked, and then that ties in obviously to the mitigation measures, which is like your physical security locks that we talked about before, and of course risk. Then it gets this probability of attack, direction of attack, time of attack, and then based on that, then you adjust your mitigation procedures to make your environment as safe as possible. I know that's a lot to cover, but that's essentially the 4 areas that we talk about in the proactive zone or the prevention preparation measures.
Well, what I like about this approach is that it's all encompassing, and it's addressing areas that have not been addressed by previously. We always talk about right of bang. We always talk about after the attack. We always talk about the hot wash. We always realize all the things that happened. We knew were going to happen, but we didn't do anything to stop it. I think it's time we start looking at our assessment and our proactive approach to addressing active violence event at schools to ensure we don't lose any more children. I mean, let's be honest. We have not been attacking the root cause. We have blamed everything but the real challenge, which is an event, a grievance that causes a child or a teacher or a parent to do something unthinkable, and we're not handling it initially when we know it's already there, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, and you pointed out a great point there is that people look at these offenders, people that do these attacks, as like mindless, psychopath monsters, right? And they're not. There are husbands, there are wives, because females do it too, right? There are daughters, there are sons, nephews, people that we know are friends, and things like this. And they've gotten into a situation where they perceive that violence is the answer. And so it's all of this is also aimed at looking at it from that perspective. So the interventions are helpful. Just having a kid who makes a threat and you expel him is really potentially making that threat worse, because now you don't have control. Now you don't have tabs on the person, or you don't have the ability to continue to help them. Not to say that discipline or putting them in jail if it's necessary or things like this isn't necessary. That certainly is. But having this zero tolerance, using discipline as your threat, to deal with the threat, instead of looking at, again, the core of what's going on with these offenders, is simply not being done. And that's the Achilles heel of this whole process, in my opinion.
And I agree. I mean, that is profound. I really think it's time for us to start addressing the issue before there's a threat of violence. We know teachers know the kids that are struggling. Mm-hmm. Teachers know the kids that are being bullied. Teachers know what's going on. They're not blind to it. But their hands are tied in some cases by the school board or by the superintendent or by the local government on what they can say to these kids for whatever reason. We need to start being human beings and taking care of one another and asking, hey, are you okay?
Yeah.
I mean, that
Yeah.
that will prevent a lot. Just being human would be helpful at this point in life.
That's actually the most profound thing that was said today, other than my rambling on, right? I mean, you just said it, right? It's taking care of each other. You see somebody in crisis, you help them, right? You don't ignore it. You don't try to make it into something it's not, like, well, it's because he's mentally ill, or it's not about that. It really is. Almost all of these people are in crisis of some sort. And it's something that they perceive that's very real to them. And we have to open our eyes and understand it from their perspective and then deal with that grievance and that crisis. Because here's the bottom line: if you can stop the crisis, you stop the motivation to kill. There's no reason to kill or hurt after that, because the crisis is gone, problem solved, right? And then that's how, at the end of the day, that is how you stop violence. That's the actual prevention. Is we're not doing it because we're tackling the person, right? Or we're trying to discipline or provide a consequence. We're actually removing the motivation. That's huge, and that's the common thread across all of this, is making it so that killing is not what they want to do anymore. That and if they don't want to kill, then we don't have violence. Simple as that.
Well, Doc, I appreciate your wisdom and knowledge about assessments and proactive approaches to this. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to next week when we'll do something new and fun for everybody. But if you're out there and you're struggling with something, get help, ask for help. And if you see somebody struggling, please reach out, give them a hug, and tell them you're there to talk to them, so we don't have any more of these events in the country.
And don't
With that,
and don't hesitate to reach out to SafeDefend, myself, anyone in the office, things like this. If we can help you, even just on the phone, to just talk about it, we're willing to do that.
you're always there for them, Doc. With that, Doc and Dave, we're out of here.
All right. Have a great day. Thanks.